And she's going to help us understand the budget project. We invited her because I had seen a presentation that she'd done for another group. And I thought it just really laid out a great deal of information that I wasn't seeing elsewhere, and laid out and graphically presented in such a way that really helped make sense of the whole process, which is very complicated, lots of moving parts. But once you get a handle on it, you can actually be a much more effective advocate and know where and how to intervene in the process. Just forgot to introduce myself. I'm Peter Bakken. I am Justice and Witness Coordinator for the Wisconsin Council of Churches. And I'm joined off camera by Rabbi Bonnie Margulis, who is the Executive Director of Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice. There she is. And Daniel Garlock, who is our intern, running some of the tech stuff behind the scenes. And there's Daniel. But we are all part of the Wisconsin Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign. And over the last almost 2 years, maybe, we've been doing a lot of work around elections, getting people to vote, getting them to know what they need to do to be able to vote, addressing some of the obstacles that people are encountering to vote. And we are still watching voting and voting rights activities, but we're kind of moving into the phase where now that we have elected our leaders, the state and federal level, this last November and in April, now's the time to be building relationships with them, reaching out to them, letting them know what is important to us, what we're seeing in our communities, how different policies are impacting the lives of ourselves, our family, our neighbors, and what we would like to see in terms of the kind of Wisconsin that we want to live, work, play, and raise families in. So, excuse me, I will be quiet now and turn it over to TR.
Thank you so much for having me. I am excited to be here. Advocacy is something that certainly gets me energized, and being able to share some tips that I found in my work with others is always a win for me. I am going to begin sharing my screen, as I do have a presentation to go with my sort of oral recitation of advocacy as well. And feel free, I will look to Peter if folks have questions in between. I have sort of dedicated some time for questions, but if people have questions in between, I'm more than happy to pause so that I can hear from all of you. So let me get this started. And just confirming, are you all able to see my screen? It should be a slide that says how Wisconsin government works.
Yep, I can see it.
Great, good deal. So I have to always provide this disclaimer that I am an attorney, but I'm not serving as your attorney or an attorney in this role. This presentation is intended for general information only, not specific legal advice, and folks should consult a qualified legal consultant with specific questions if you do have those. So I'd like to start off a little bit with level setting of what is policy. When we're talking about advocating for policy and good advocacy tools, it's first important to make sure we're all started on the same level playing field of, at least in this presentation, my use of the word policy. So I consider policy sort of in these 4 categories that I've had on the screen here. It's made, it's a construction, it's something that has been created in response to an issue or a problem that requires some type of solution. It is also what the government chooses to do as an actual power or actual action, or what the government chooses not to do, an implied action about this issue or this problem that requires a solution. So it's a construct, and it's what is chosen to be done about it or not done about it. It is also can take the form of a law or regulation or a set of laws and regulations that govern this issue or this policy. And what I think sometimes can be most frustrating for the attorney in me, who was once a litigator that's used to a beginning, a middle, and end of a trial. At the end of the trial, you have a decision, and that's what it is that policy is really an ongoing process. And actually, in its best form of our democracy, it should be an ongoing process. It does not always have a clear beginning or end. It's continually being reassessed, revisited, and revised as solutions that may initially have been created for a policy or for issue may need to be reassessed. That creates more issues, and you have to work then through those policies as well. So then the question of is then who makes policy? If I've given this definition that policy is a construct, it can be a set of laws, it's an ongoing process, it can be what a government body does or doesn't do about an issue. Who are these people then that are constructing and making this policy, or what are those entities that are constructing and making the policy? Who is the government that I'm speaking of? So you certainly have the legislature, in our state level, also at our federal level, as in Congress and our Senate, can certainly make policy, and other local elected bodies. So we have the state legislature, but you also may have in your city or your county a school board or county supervisors or city council. Those are other legislative bodies that certainly have the policy-making ability and authority. We also have the executive branch at the very local level. That could be a mayor or a county exec. At the state level, it can be a governor. At the national level, it's the president. That executive branch of our government in all of those different ways that I described can sign or veto bills. They can propose a budget. They can make appointments. Here in the state of Wisconsin, the governor makes appointments to certain boards and certainly the agencies that are within the cabinet of state government. Agencies meaning Department of Health Services, Department of Children and Families, Department of Transportation, as some examples. You should know, though, in the state of Wisconsin, the governor does not appoint the Department of Justice head, who is the assistant attorney general, the attorney general, and does not, the governor also does not appoint the Department of Public Instruction state superintendent, the superintendent for the state of the Department of Public Instruction. I have to always give the caveat that the current state superintendent, Superintendent Carolyn Sanford Taylor, was appointed by the governor in this special circumstance because the governor, when he became governor, was before that state superintendent. And so he left that role in the middle of a term in which the governor of the state is allowed to appoint someone. But normally, as we just saw this past election cycle, that is an elected position. Who else makes policy? Departments and agencies of the state. So I gave a few. In this case, I have Department of Health Services as my example. These departments and agencies, they create and they administer programs. So there may be a larger policy that's decided at the state legislative level, but that program or that policy is enacted at a certain agency level. And so as that agency is creating that program in order for that policy change to come through, that is a form of policy in their creation. It may be that the state level policy has some general boundaries or specific boundaries to it, but that development and that implementation of that program, that policy, the regulations around that program or that policy happens at the department and agency level. And that department will have those rules. They will monitor the program. They will evaluate it. They will study it. And that's where you kind of see that ongoing process that I referred to of what policy can look like and what it does. You also have the judiciary, the bench, the courts are a form of policymakers as they interpret legislative intent. And as they hear and decide lawsuits or criminal cases, that creates a legal precedent for this is how this judge has interpreted these set of facts as it relates to this law. And that's how this judge made this decision. And that in a way creates policy. Specifically, when people ask, what does the legislature do other than being a space where policy can be created? They pass legislation and they pass resolutions. Resolutions often are an intent or a purpose for a legislative body to do something or to show their support of something. And legislation is obviously what we refer to before something becomes a law. So a policy or one of those solutions to a problems as we defined policy earlier. The legislator also sets and approves budgets. They also hold hearings and other fact-finding activities. As right now, currently in the process that we're in of our budget process, we do have the Joint Finance Committee who is here holding public hearings on the budget that the governor has proposed. And they also have hearings on bits and pieces of bills outside of the budget throughout their legislative session. And they also the legislator also provides helps to constituents. Here I've just enumerated and outlined what those state agencies are or departments are in the state, because there are a lot of them, and oftentimes people just may not know that. And so here's a list of all of those different state agencies. The secretaries or the heads of these agencies are appointed by the governor, again, except for the Department of Justice, which is the Attorney General, and the Department of Public Instruction, which is the state superintendent. This is where I like to give an example, because there's a lot of information I just gave you about the definition of policy and who makes policy. And so here's just another visual of how you can see policy creation and the sort of evolution of policy. So it's in a circle instead of linear because of that ongoing process that I referred to. And I'll start here with identifying the problem, right? And when it comes to who can identify the problem, when you're looking at who's involved in this policy process, or more importantly, what I started off this with is where the advocacy exists and how you can advocate, is identifying the problem as that sort of first step. And here it can be advocacy groups. It may be your group. It may be a group of, neighborhood watch. It may be just a group of neighbors who are recognizing that a particular stoplight in their neighborhood is causing a lot of traffic issues. So most times the person who is closest to the problem is able to identify it because they're directly impacted by it. However, it can also be elected officials who may be doing, tours of their district, who may be listening to constituents, who may just have a pulse on what's going on in their district, or for a governor in their state, for a mayor in their city. It can be community leaders or community members. It doesn't have to be someone formally with a leader title. It can also be government agencies. They can identify a problem, especially if there's a program that a government agency like the Department of Health Services is expected to run. And then they can identify a problem as they're running this program. They can really realize on paper, this was a good idea, but this is what we're experiencing in practice. And so those are all possibilities of who can identify the problem in starting this policy phase. And then it's raising the problem's profile, right? So if I've stubbed my toe, that's a problem for me. But others may not be aware of that problem or understand why that problem needs to be connected to them. Maybe I stubbed my toe on, some sort of embedment in a roadway or a highway or a walkway that others could do the same thing on. And so I really need to raise the problem's profile and speak to why this is an issue. And when it comes to who could do that, where are the advocacy points for that? Same groups. It can be advocacy groups who are doing that raising of the profile of this problem, letting others know about it, elected officials, government agencies, or community members. Another example that I like to give is sort of, there are a collection of orange farmers, and they have really come together as the collective of orange farmers to really decide that, right now we're having our orange farm market on Tuesdays, and that really doesn't work well for us. When it comes to the time that it takes for us to, collect the oranges, process the oranges, and get together as a collective, Tuesdays are a really bad day. And so we need to raise this profile to maybe our city mayor. Maybe there is a council or a body on all orange growers that we need to raise this problem to, but we need to let people know of why Tuesdays is a really bad day to sell our oranges. We really need to do it on a Friday. And that goes into developing a solution to that problem, right? So you know what the problem is, you've let others know about the problem so that they see that there's a problem and it's not just you and how it impacts others. And now you're going through developing a solution to this problem so that then you can get a rally around this solution as that policy. And again, you have advocacy groups who can do this developing of a solution. You can have elected officials, the legislature, to do this. Government agencies, community members can all be a part of this developing a solution to the problem. And then there's implementing the problem, right? So you finally gotten everyone to rally behind, orange growers need to sell their oranges on Fridays instead of Tuesdays. We've heard testimony from these small orange growers who really are explaining why Tuesday doesn't work for them. And there are tons of people who love oranges or use oranges as in their small business who are also rallied behind this. So you have a huge magnitude of folks who are on team. Let's change the market on oranges from Tuesdays to Fridays. So you do that. You go through the whole process, and now on Fridays is when we have those orange growers having their market to sell their oranges. And so you implement that policy. You've changed it. You put the notices out. Everyone knows now it's not Tuesday, it's Friday. You've communicated. Maybe you use social media. Advocacy groups can help with that implementation. Government agencies, community organizations can help with that. There may be a collection of small business owners who have tons of small business members who uses those oranges. So they're helping to make sure that they get the word out that Friday is now the day. Now you need to evaluate that. What you maybe didn't think about or didn't realize is that Friday is also the same day where there's a lot of traffic area around this market. So now that you've implemented selling your oranges from Tuesday to Friday, you have to evaluate the impact of that. Now we notice that we're having more traffic congestion. And then that's possibly a problem for children or families who are walking to the market. Or maybe what happened when you changed it to Friday is that threw off the schedule for the banana sellers. And now the banana sellers are not so happy that the Friday orange growers are in the market selling their product on Fridays because it has thrown off their schedule. And again, advocacy groups, government agencies, community organizations can all be a part about evaluating this impact. And I always say agencies, government agencies like departments and community organizations are so important because oftentimes, the state legislature, the governor, sort of those higher up in state government may develop a solution, but they are the ones tasked with actually bringing it to fruition and implementing it. And so they are the ones that are uniquely positioned along with community members to evaluate an issue and be able to see how it's going and what needs to be done. And so when you're in that evaluation stage, you may realize, okay, Friday is not a good day for the orange growers. Or now it means that we need to move the banana sellers to another date too, because we've already moved the orange growers. And then you've identified another problem. And it goes back into that cycle of that ongoing process of policy and how it goes with creating solutions to a problem and acting on that. So I will pause there because that was a lot of information just to see if there are any immediate questions from folks about sort of what I've presented up to this point. Okay. On virtual calls, I've learned to wait a bit so people get a chance to unmute themselves and to speak. But I've also learned that in general, silence is most times agreement. All right, so we'll keep moving through here. So these are just some quick reference points that I want to share with you all. We've talked about policy, how it's made, who makes it as a level setting before we get into the process of policy and we get into the advocacy sort of tips and essentials. This is another quick reference that I think is important for folks to have. My favorite website when I was working as a lobbyist and an advocate before I was in the governor's office is legis.wi.gov, legis.wi.gov. On that site is where you can see all of the representatives in the Senate and the House, or the Assembly is the language we use at the state level. You can find all of those folks. You can find who represents you. You can find what were the legislations that were brought up in past sessions, legislative sessions, or current legislative sessions. You can find out whether they've been put into a committee. You can find out what the committees are. Just tons of awesome information on that site for an advocate looking for information in order to set yourself up for success in your advocacy. Some also quick reference things that folks just need to know as you understand the lay of the land is in the state of Wisconsin, we have 33 state senators, and they have 4-year terms. We have 99 assembly state representatives. So at the state of Wisconsin and also in our federal government, we have what we call a bifurcated legislature. So we have 2 different houses or 2 different bodies. You have the assembly, which is what it's called in Wisconsin at the state level, or it's called the House in the federal level. And then you have the Senate, which we also call the Senate here in Wisconsin, and that's what it's called at the federal level. The Senate has a authority or a hierarchy over the Assembly, but it's 2 separate bodies. And so in Wisconsin, we have 33 state senators and 99 Assembly state representatives, so they have 2-year terms. So based on where you live in the state, you're going to have a state senator that represents you, and you're also going to have a state representative that represents you, in addition to who may be the school board representative in your neighborhood, or the city council person, or the alder person in your neighborhood. The way that we set up that process of the Assembly and the Senate in Wisconsin is there's a Speaker of the Assembly, which is a leader, and a leader of the Senate. So they have different names, but they're ultimately the ones that are in charge or the leader of those 2 bodies, of the Assembly and the Senate. And it's really important to know this because those leaders, the Speaker of the Assembly and the leader of the Senate, are able to name committees. So when legislation, which are just those solutions to problems, come up and are drafted into a legislative document that has all of those special terms that they use, but ultimately is just a solution to a problem, those legislation pieces are referred to a committee. So instead of having all 33 state senators and all 99 assembly representatives look over that legislation right away, the state legislator has created this process where you'll have a committee. It could be the Committee on Orange Growers in Wisconsin, right? So that committee is the one who first heard that problem that we wanted to move orange growing from Tuesday to Friday. And so the Speaker of the Assembly and the leader of the Senate are super important because they name the committee. So they decide which committees are going to exist. They choose those committees and they decide who are the chairs of those committees, and they decide the members of their party who will be on that committee. So the Speaker of the Assembly and the leader of the Senate can be from either party. Most times they're from the party that has most control, meaning the most members of that party in those different bodies. And then that leader then names the committee, chooses the committee, picks the chair of the committee, and decides which members of their party will be on that committee. So those spaces of leadership have a lot of power to them. And the reason why I note them here is because you may elect your state representative or your assembly representative, but you as a public have no decision on that process. This is within the legislative body where they elect an assembly speaker and a leader of the Senate, and then that person has this power. So in the state of Wisconsin, the Speaker of the Assembly is Robin Vos. The leader of the Senate is now Devin LeMahieu. Another important quick reference point that I wanted to bring out is that in Wisconsin, we have the Joint Committee on Finance. It's abbreviated as JFC, even though it's Joint Committee on Finance. I don't know why it started of inverting those words, but that's what happens. It's unique because it combines budget and finance in Wisconsin in a way that doesn't happen in other states. Other states have a separate budget and a separate appropriations committee. And the reason why this is called a joint committee is because other committees stay within their legislative bodies. So you may have tons of committees for the Senate, tons of committee for the Assembly. So there may be a health committee, or as the example I was using, the Committee on Orange Growers, but there's one for the Senate and there's one for the Assembly. The Joint Committee on Finance means you actually combine them. You have members of the Senate and members of the Assembly on that one committee. There are a total of 16 members on that committee. and they need 9 affirmative or yes votes in order to pass something out of that committee. Some other things that I wanted to just share as I use language, and it's important to make sure that I've level set with that, is when you use the language of a bill, that is when something hasn't been signed by a mayor, a governor, or president. So it's a proposal of a solution that has passed through the different bodies of government and the legislature and voted yes, but is before being signed by the executive branch, so a mayor, a governor, a president, and so it's not yet a law, it's still a bill. An act is the language that's used after it's signed and it's in law. So you may have Senate Bill 123 or Assembly Bill 456, and we'll be using that bill language. So even though the committee might have approved it and said yes, even though the Senate or the Assembly or both might have approved it and said, yes, this is the solution we want to this problem, this is a new policy we want to enact, it doesn't become a law or an act until the governor signs it. Or again, if you're talking about local, the mayor, or if you're talking about national, president. The Legislative Reference Bureau is also an important body to know in this whole process. They are the translators, I would say, of the language. Typically, they are lawyers and they are nonpartisan. So it doesn't mean that they have Republican and Democratic members of the Legislative Reference Bureau. That would be bipartisan. They are nonpartisan, meaning they don't have a political agenda either way. They are the ones who may take that the legislators use when there's a solution to a problem. So they know what the problem is, they know what the solution is. They may not have the words for it to put it into a legislative legal language, or I should say legislative language. And that's where you have the Legislative Reference Bureau, who would actually do that translating for whatever that solution is to a problem, put it into that language, which is the bill language that you'll see and that you'll read. Just some other level setting on terms that I'll be using. Amendments are suggested changes to a bill. So this is before it's been signed, it's not a law yet. And these amendments can be deleting something or adding something or substituting something. An appropriation is basically spending money or spending funds, and is being authorized by a legislative body to do this spending. I also will talk a lot about the biennial budget. That's sort of the space that we're in now, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. A biennial budget is our state budget, and it covers a 2-year fiscal biennium. So fiscal versus, for instance, a calendar year. So we might think of a year as January 1 to December 31st. That's a calendar year. But a fiscal year starts July 1 of the odd year and goes until June 30th of the next odd year. So the biennial budget that we're talking about in the state of Wisconsin is talking about year 2021 to 2023, and ideally would start July 1 of 2021 and go into June 30th of 2023. There's a little asterisk with that, but we'll get into that later. So when I say biennial budget, I mean the budget for spending, borrowing, and taxing, so getting money in. All of that part is the budget over a 2-year fiscal year, which is 2021 to 2023. I've already gone through a bill as a proposed change or proposed solution to a problem. Bipartisan means representing both political parties or more political parties. Nonpartisan means that there's no bias towards any political party or influence of a political party. A resolution is sort of a formal statement by a legislative body of an opinion or an intent to do something, or of a interest in doing something. A veto means the action which allows a no or rejection from the governor of a bill. And a veto override, which you'll hear me use, is a vote of both the Assembly and the Senate, so those 2 houses of the legislative bodies, to overturn the governor's rejection or a no vote. And in order for a veto override to be successful, you need to receive 2/3 of the vote in both the Senate and the Assembly. So if the governor says a bill has come through, a proposal of a solution to a problem has come through, but it's not yet a law because the governor hasn't signed it. If the governor says no to it or rejects it, he vetoes it, there is still a possibility for the legislature, if both houses vote 2/3 majority, to overturn the governor's veto. So this is what I consider the Schoolhouse Rock sort of remix or bridge version of how a bill becomes a law. High level overview for you. We'll get a little bit more specific later on in the presentation, but just a high level overview because it's a lot of information and a lot of things to remember. And so this is just a good basic foundation to go back to as far as how a bill becomes a law. The first part is that a bill is drafted. That's where that legislative reference bureau that I told you guys about, those lawyers who are nonpartisan, they will draft up the language with the legislator on what this solution to this problem looks like. The bill is then assigned to the Senate or the Assembly. So if the legislator working on it was in the Senate, it'll get a Senate Bill 1 number, or if it was the legislator working on was in the Assembly, it'll get Assembly Bill 1 number. If there was a senator and an Assembly person working on it together, then it would each have a version in the Senate and a version in the Assembly. The bill is referred to a committee. The example I used before is like the Committee on Oranges. Now, we currently don't have a Committee on Oranges, but there could be one if the Speaker of the Assembly or the Leader of the Senate chose that. Typically, those committees are general bucket sort of points. So like a health committee, a children's committee, children welfare, or children and families welfare committee. We recently had a Medicaid committee, which was new. There's also a transportation, a juvenile justice. There are tons of committees, and you can look up all of the committees on both the Senate and the Assembly at that legis.wi.gov website that I shared. So that bill, that proposed solution to a problem, is referred to a committee. There's a hearing on that bill, on that proposed solution. And that happens at the committee level. And that is where members of the public are able to come into and speak to that committee of legislators and share their opinions about that proposed solution, whether it's for it or against it. Sometimes people just are sharing information on it of, I think this is a blind spot that the bill doesn't show up on that you may need to consider in implementation, or it's just, here's some information on what this bill would or would not do. I'm not taking a side on it, I'm just providing information. And that's where the public is engaged in formally in the process. Then the committee is going to vote on that bill, on that solution to the problem. And then the bill or that solution is scheduled for a vote on the floor, meaning to have all of the members of the Assembly or all of the members of the Senate to vote on it after they've gotten that recommendation from the committee. Now, there are times where a bill, a proposed solution, may not make it out of the committee. The committee doesn't vote yes on it. And then that's where that bill can often die. And at times there's advocacies, solutions or workarounds to try to then bring that up again, but that is a possibility in the process. If the bill is scheduled for a floor vote and the floor vote is then conducted and there are enough yes votes, the majority, the bill is then sent to the opposite legislative body to repeat the same process. So if you didn't have a bill start off in the Senate and the Assembly, if it just started off in the Senate, it needs to go through steps 1 through 8 in the Assembly. If it started off in the Assembly, it needs to go through steps 1 through 8 in the Senate. Because although you have two different bodies and they have their own different authorities, their own committees, when it comes down to a final bill proposal, solution to a problem proposal, you still need to have the same in both houses, and it needs to be worked out between both houses. You can't have the Assembly pass something about orange growers and they say Wednesday, and the Senate passes something about orange growers and they say Friday, and then expect that to be a law, because that would be confusing. So you have to repeat that process in both houses of the government. This is sort of a deeper vibe. I'm a visual person, so it's another way to visually see this process. So this is on the Assembly side or the House side, which is those 99 state representatives. This is how it would flow. The state representative or the Legislative Reference Bureau would have co-sponsors on that bill, that proposed solution to a problem. Co-sponsors are other people, other legislators or representative in that house who are saying, yes, I agree with this. I didn't write the bill, but I agree with it. And before we even have a vote or a committee, I want to express my agreement with it by co-sponsoring this bill, this proposed solution to a problem. And so there will be an introduction or a first reading of that. There will be then put into this committee, as I shared. There will be that public hearing. That was step 5 in my previous slide. So it's just another way of looking at the same process with a little bit more detail. And then after that public hearing, the committee may make amendments to it. So they may hear back from the public and say, you know, it started off with saying orange growers on Friday, but it never gave a time. So how about we make an amendment where it says orange growers on Fridays, but they're selling their oranges between this time. That wasn't in the initial proposal, but that's an amendment that we've made to it as the committee based on feedback that we've heard from the public hearings or from advocacy groups or from other legislators or what have you. And then the committee will take an executive action. That just means that they vote on that, and that vote is not with the public. So when they take executive action or go into executive action, that means it's just the committee, just the legislators debating, talking about it, and making amendments and deciding on it. It's important to note that the committee may make amendments and there's not like another public hearing where it then goes back to the public of like, these are the changes we made to this initial solution to the problem. What do you think about it? Those are just amendments that the legislature is able to make. And then the committee will make a recommendation of, yes, let's vote this with these amendments into the larger body group of our assembly or our Senate. Joint Committee on Finance, if there's any level of the amendment that has a fiscal or money spending component to it, it'll have to go through that Joint Committee on Finance. If not, it'll go to the Assembly Rules Committee, make sure that everything is right. There'll be a second, by right, I mean that there's no issues to the legislative language or that the amendments haven't changed anything that would be contradictory to existing state law or state policy. There'll be a second reading where those amendments will then be considered again by the legislative body of like, you made these amendments. I don't know if I can vote on it with this amendment. I was on team voting on it before these amendments. And that's where that debate happens. Again, not public comment for that part. These are things that sometimes a organization called WisI or Wisconsin I, they will televise these readings or these floor sessions, but there are not necessarily a public entryway when it comes to these amendments. In a formal way, but advocates can certainly during this process let legislators know these are why those amendments could be problematic, or these are why the impacts of, or here are some impacts of the amendments that you're thinking of. So the legislative body will debate the amendments. They'll calendar it for a third reading. There's an engrossment process, which is a big word for making sure they've incorporated all of the different amendments that may have been suggested and debated on. And then at this point, that's the end of the amendments, and the vote has to happen with the current addition of that policy, of that solution to a problem. And the vote will happen if it passes, meaning there's a majority vote. There's a message to the Senate to say, hey, Senate, this is a solution to a problem that we had a committee on, we had a public hearing on, we debated amongst the committee, we debated amongst the larger group, we've passed it in the group with these amendments or sometimes without amendments, and we're giving it to you now, Senate, so it can go through the same process because we can't have two separate things happening because that's confusing and not consistent. And it'll go through that same process in the Senate as well. And it's fair that it can start in the Senate and then they send it to the Assembly. It just depends on where the bill starts at. And typically that's based on who initiated it, which legislator initiated it. One point that I would mention here is the concurrent step is making sure what I have referred to along all this time is that a bill must pass both houses in the identical form. It cannot be different. You can't have the House saying, you know, farm growers on Fridays at 2 p.m. and the Senate saying for orange growers, excuse me, on Fridays at 3:30 p.m. It has to all be the same. When the bill has gone through both houses successfully, when there's concurrence, meaning they say the same thing, the houses converge, there's an enrollment of the bill, and then it is prepared to be sent to the governor for signature. Sent is actually interesting word here. The governor can call for it. It can be sent. There's a time period once it's either the governor calls for it or it's be sent to the governor. There's a very specific time period in which the governor then has to act on that bill in order for it to go into law. And that includes if the governor is going to veto it in its entirety or a portion of it. So once the governor has that bill and it's gone through that whole process in both houses, bill without a signature, as I let you all know, is still a bill. It's not an act. It's not law yet. It has to be signed or vetoed within 6 days. The Secretary of State will then publicize that bill. And then there's approval of it if the governor does not veto it. And that approval, that date of signature or approval of it is the date of enactment of that law, of what is now an act. The Secretary of State will then again publicize that, and 1 day after the day of enactment. So after the day of signature is when the Secretary of State will then publicize this act. So Bill 123 will become Act 1, and that will happen within that day's time. So again, if there's a veto, as in the entire bill or a portion of the bill, then the Assembly and the Senate can choose to go back to try to do an override, which I mentioned, which is to say we disagree with the governor. And if we have at least 2/3 of the vote that also disagrees with the governor in both houses, we can then override the governor's decision. That also has to be within 6 days, not counting Sundays. And then if there is that amount of votes, then that would actually be, it could be enacted unless the governor has another objection to it. And I just mentioned this, that's a super in the weeds, very detailed part, but I mention it because it is important to know that there is still that back and forth between the governor and the legislature, even in a veto or a veto override process and a bill becoming a law. Again, that was a lot of information there, so I'm going to pause to see if there are any questions from folks on that. And if there are comments in the chat, I'm not able to see them, so I'll lean on Peter if there's anything that I am missing.
I'm not seeing anything. I had a question. Okay. Does the governor have, I think at the federal level, it's called a pocket veto, neither signing nor vetoing it? Does the governor have that option, and what happens?
So for a state level, there has to be an action by the governor, either a veto or a signing within those 6 days. If that doesn't happen, then it's, I believe, I'll double check, then it's automatically taken up because it's been passed by both bodies, taken up as that law. Without the governor's signature is what I believe. I don't believe that the governor cannot act on it altogether and then it sort of just dies. I believe he has to either veto it or enact it, or the default is that it will go into effect. But I can double check that so that I'm giving you guys the right information. Good deal. And I will say that 6 days is used as an advocacy tool by the legislature. So the legislature may choose to fast track something and send it to the governor, because then his clock, his or her, in this case right now it's a he, his clock starts at that 6 days, and that's a pressure point versus a bill that may go through the legislature a little bit slower. So the governor and his team can be following it, can be looking at the amendments, can be tracking it, can be deciding what his thoughts are on it, what the impacts are, could be talking to other advocates or looking at the testimony of other advocates earlier in the process of where they're at, versus something that's fast tracked and then sends to the governor. It puts him in this pressure point of vetoing or approving it in a 6-day time period, and really looking at what the impact of that bill would be, which is what further leads me to believe that there's not that option in the state for the governor to not act, without the solution being that then that bill does become an act even without his action on it. All right, so now, now we have more specifically, I went through the general process of a bill becoming the law. Now we have the very specific biennial budget, that definition that I gave earlier, which is the fiscal biennium, a 2-year period of a state budget. I would say budget in general can seem overwhelming and a little intimidating, but it's ultimately the collection of what a state is spending, what the state is bringing in as income or revenue, and including what the state may be borrowing, right? And so if I'm looking at my personal budget, I have a salary, and then I have bills that I have to pay, and then I have things that I want to do just of interest. So in addition to paying my light bill and my internet bill, I may also want to be saving to go on a trip. Or I also may want to dedicate my money towards a particular charity, or I also want to take some of my money because I'm going to prepare a business on the side, right? So those, what you spend, what you bring in, what you're borrowing, what you have in your credit card is a budget. And the state budget is no different than that. Obviously, it's much larger because it's for the entire state, but that's ultimately what the budget is: what you spend, what you bring in. And I should be clear, when I talk about what we bring in or revenue to the state, that means taxes. So the timeline of the biennial budget starts September 15th of an even year. So that would have been September 15th of 2020. State agencies will submit a budget to the governor, and they do this via the state budget office. The state budget office is within the larger agency of the Department of Administration, which is one of the larger agencies in state government. So the state agencies are going to submit their budget to the governor. State budget office is going to have those review. You need those in by September 15th. I should note that each governor will give a directive to their agencies, and those agencies will generally have those directives from the governor. This governor, one of the directives that they gave to agencies was to really look at equity in their budget requests and in their process, and how they could prioritize and value equity. Other governors may give other directives as well. I should also note that in this budget review, by state statute, by law, there is also providing a budget that has the alternative of, if there's no additional money, what you would look like, and even in decreasing by 5% your budget of what it would look like. So there are those state boundaries that are put on there through state statute that gives that cushion room of, if there's no additional spending, what would your budget look like, as well as if there's extra spending, what would your budget look like? By November 20th of the even year, so in this example, that's November 20th of 2020, the DOA secretary, the Secretary of the Department of Administration, will provide the governor or the governor-elect, if it happens to be in the years in which we're switching governor, and each member of the next legislature with the total amount of each agency's biennial budget request. So it's not hidden or it's not secret. What are those total numbers that Department of Health Services, Department of Transportation, Department of Children and Families, what are they proposing? What's that bottom line budget that they're requesting? And then the last Tuesday in January of the odd year, so the last Tuesday of January 2021, if we're talking about this current budget, is when the governor will deliver his biennial budget message and will give the biennial budget to the Joint Finance Committee. There's a asterisk there. The governor can request an extension, and the legislature can provide that extension. The governor did request that extension this biennial budget, and so if folks were able to tune in, the governor gave his biennial budget message in February based on the extension that the Joint Finance Committee or the legislature, gave him. So he did his February announcement of what's in his budget, which includes all of those administrations, those agencies underneath him, and what they've included in their budget. And then in late February, early March of the odd year, so that would be late February, early March of 2021, Joint Finance typically holds agency briefings. This happened actually in early April this year. From the Joint Finance Committee, agency briefings are meaning the Joint Finance Committee are able to ask the different agencies about their budget that they sent and they proposed. They can ask all the questions of where is this money coming from? Why do you want to spend it? Tell me where this came from. How have you evaluated that you need this new money? They don't necessarily have to do all of the agencies. In fact, this time around, I believe the Joint Finance Committee did briefings with the Department of Workforce Development, the Public Service Commission. I'm forgetting a few others, but I think there was only about 4 or 5 that the Joint Finance held an agency briefing where they requested that the agency present their budget to them where they can ask questions. It's important to know that these agency briefings are open to the public, whether it's in person or whether it's being streamed through a service, but they are not open for public commentary. So although the public can see the discourse of what's happening, they are not able to comment on these agency briefings. And then late March, early April of the odd year, the Joint Finance will hold public hearings throughout the state. Again, the timeline was a little off. So it was about that same. We went from, I think, late March through April. The last public hearing of the Joint Finance Committee will be April 28th, I believe. And so they'll go through the process of going around the state so that the Joint Finance Committee can hear from others about their opinions on the budget. And again, this is the budget that the governor has proposed and that the agencies are proposing. And so this is the Joint Finance Committee collecting this data, collecting these fact findings in order to go to the next part of the process, which we're about to talk about, which means the Joint Finance begins voting on each of the pieces of the budget. And they call that executive action, just like in the example I gave before of how a bill becomes a law when a committee takes executive action. So they've gotten the intel, they've heard from people in the public, they've gotten the written comments, and now they're deciding on which parts of the budget that the governor and his agencies have proposed, which parts they're going to take, what they're going to add, what they're going to do with the budget. Once the Joint Finance Committee does that, it finishes its budget. It's called a 999 motion, which is a wrap up. It sends its budget version of the budget to the full legislator. So now, just like in that how a bill becomes a law process, the committee does the fact finding, they'll vote on it, they'll make changes, they'll make amendments, and then they send it to the full legislature in the Assembly and in the Senate to vote on it. Same thing happens with the Joint Finance Committee. It just happens to be that the budget is a really big special bill, but it has that same characteristics of what I share with you all. So each house, the Assembly and the Senate, must vote on the Joint Finance's version of the budget. They can attempt to amend it there. So even if the Joint Finance Committee made changes to the governor's budget, it's possible that in it going to the Assembly and the Senate, they can also try to make other amendments to the budget. There's a conference committee. If the houses' versions are different from each other, the same rule applies as in my previous explanation. Excuse me, which is that you can't have 2 different versions in the houses. The budget is then sent to the governor for veto or passage. And again, that sent is actually not accurate language. The governor will call for the budget. The budget comes back to the legislator for possible veto overrides. And so because of the nature of the budget is appropriating or spending money, the governor does have the power of a partial veto, where the governor can, instead of just rejecting the whole budget, can also have parts of it that may be rejected or line item, I should say, line item vetoed, parts of it. And then that's where the same process that I shared before could happen with a veto override. And that partial veto or line item veto power happens anytime there is a spending or an appropriation element to that bill, or again, that proposed solution to a problem. And so we are currently at, just to make it very clear here, the Joint Finance holds public hearings throughout the state. So after that April 28th public hearing, we're going to be looking at the joint finance beginning to vote on each part of the agency's budget and the governor's budget, and beginning to then make that executive decision and voting on what version of the governor's budget they're going to be sending to the full body of legislators in the Senate and the Assembly to vote on or to amend. And currently in our state legislature, the Republicans have the majority, meaning they have more seats in the Senate and the Assembly. And the message that has come from them is that they're planning on starting over from scratch from the governor's budget. I should let folks know that there are certainly bills or proposals to problems, solutions to problems that are proposed that spend money that are outside of the budget process. So it's not like if you don't get in the budget, there's no opportunity. So this is just a long statutory language to say that there are non-budget fiscal bills that'll come out through the year after the budget. The budget is just a unique opportunity to get solutions to problems that require spending money, is to get those into the state budget, and then you have a 2-year time frame in which that money being spent will be covered. But there are certainly bills that spend money outside of that process. Pausing again here for more questions for folks, and I know we're very close to our noon hour as well. But any questions that folks have on this, the budget process, advocacy points? Okay. I did initially have a few sections on advocacy and what it is, but I do want to respect you all's time. And I know that we are 3 minutes to the noon hour. So I think I will pause it there for sure. But I have shared with Peter the slides that you all, that I used today for you all to be able to have for yourself. And then I'm totally open to, if I need to, coming back again. This was great. Or if you all just want to ask any follow-up questions about the presentation to me, but you didn't get a chance to do it now, I'm open to that as well.
Yeah, thanks, DR. We do have one question in the chat, which is something I was thinking about as well. Bonnie is asking, are there other opportunities for advocacy besides testifying to joint finance?
That's a great question. Yes, I think that you can talk to your legislator in the sense of the person at the Senate and the Assembly that represents you throughout this entire process. But outside of the person who represents you, you can also talk to those representatives who are in the decision-making space. So you can individually contact members of the Joint Finance Committee, or you can contact the Speaker of the Assembly or the leader of the Senate. You can contact the chair of the Health Committee or the chair of the Committee on Children or the chairs of these committees to express your concerns, that because they hold that leadership role, them not being your direct representative doesn't take away from their responsibility as an elected official to hear your concerns, especially if you're an advocate that has a uniquely positioned sort of relationship to whatever that advocacy point is, right? So something that's impacting your community, and you're hearing that from your community because you're a safe space in the faith community to hear that feedback. In addition to, talking to your legislator, talking to members of Joint Finance, talking to leaders in the legislature who may not represent you, whether it's at public hearings or it's outside of public hearings, you can also advocate to the general public. So you can be the one who sparks someone else doing that public hearing or talking to their legislator. Maybe they live in a different district, or they have a different perspective that could be more persuasive. And so instead of you being that voice, you can encourage them to be that voice. And the way you do that is by sharing to them, elevating the profile of that problem. This is an advocacy point. This is an element of the budget that we really want to keep in the budget. My group or I have been getting our voices sore, yelling about this, maybe not actually yelling, but, doing the work on it. But let me educate you so that you can also join in on this advocacy point. Maybe you're that banana grower, right? That actually is in favor of the orange growers having their market on Fridays instead of Tuesdays. And no one would expect that because you're a banana banana grower, but you actually have a reason why this will be helpful. Your voice can be very important and very persuasive in that advocacy message. And of course, you can also advocate in what we call the bully pulpit, the social media or the general public, of just taking a stance on a position and being very public about your stance on the position. Because what that does is that lets the public, not just the legislature, know where you stand on a position. And so when the legislature or the governor does something opposite from that, that then puts us on the dial of having to explain or speak to why that may be.
Great, thank you. Yeah,
Yes.
that's extremely helpful. We've got lots of avenues for input, and that's great to know. And I assume even after the budget's done, like you mentioned with those non-budget fiscal items, things that were pulled out of the budget that are still important for us are things that we can still advocate for.
Most definitely. Most definitely. As I say, as an advocate, obviously your goal is to get the thing you want to get done. But a secondary goal sometimes, because advocacy is not for the faint of heart and it takes a lot of work, can simply be, I told the people who were in the positions of power to make this decision, what the impact of their decision would be. And so they can't say that they didn't know that I was for it or this would be the impact. And that's also an advocacy win.
Great, thank you. That's great. And just to mention, as we close up, Bonnie also put into the chat that all the hearings will be streamed on Wisconsin Eye. You can learn more about the hearings or provide input through a web form at the Joint Finance Committee's budget page, and we'll send out these specific links afterwards as well and put them on our Facebook and so on, and in our newsletter, because you can also fill out a form, and you can also fill out a form online, and you can also send an email to the Joint Finance, but we'll share that information later on.
Awesome.
But yes, we are just a little bit past time, and I think that was great. I've been working in this space for a long time, and there were terms you defined and helped me to understand. So I'm sure if people didn't get it all the first time through, we are recording this. It will be on our Facebook page and website and so on, so people can review. But
awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I have to hop off for my next one, but I appreciate you all, and go advocacy.
All right.
All right, then. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.